Today's dissection is of a heart. So what we have here in front of us is a sheep heart. And let's look at the outside just a little bit before we slice into the inside stuff. So the heart would be sitting in the sheep, and this would be the right side, and over here we would have the left side. So what we have here is we have up here at the top the right atrium. Down here would be the right ventricle. Over here we would have the left atrium and the left ventricle. So the left ventricle here is much larger than the right. Not necessarily different in internal volume, but certainly much more muscular, as we would have talked about in lecture. So that's pretty much the outside. If we look at the backside, this is where we're going to see things. So here we have the aorta coming out. We would have pulmonary arteries and veins coming out here. Mostly those are exiting on the backside. So we'll see the entrances to those hopefully once we slice inside the heart. To actually get the heart sliced for a good front and back, what I'm going to try to do is take off the front half of the heart, leaving the back half so we can see hopefully all four chambers, all of the major valves all at once. We're trying to replicate really the picture in the textbook. That's going to take several minutes of careful work, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the filming, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes hopefully with the fully sliced open product. So see you in a minute. Alright, so I've done some pre-dissection here to try to make this a little smoother. So here's our heart as it originally was in the right side, left side arrangement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this front half of the heart off and set it over to the side there. And this is what it looks like inside. Now in pictures, and you can probably find some other folks who can do a more beautiful dissection and make it look better at the end, but this is what we've got. So right here, we have the right atrium. So it was going to get blood from the inferior and superior vena cava coming in on the backside, and it would then pump that blood to the next chamber, which is the right ventricle we have right here. So we'll go ahead and open that up. And the connection between the right atrium and the right ventricle is this flap. And here we have that flap. This is the tricuspid valve. So I've sliced through it a little bit here, but we can see that it is very well anchored in place here. It actually has 3 flaps to it, and so blood would come from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into our right ventricle down here. We'll look at the chordae tendineae actually on the other side of the heart. It's a little easier to look at, but those straps that are holding the tricuspid valve from going backwards, that's the chordae tendineae that we mentioned earlier. When the right ventricle contracts, it's going to push the blood to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries. That's best viewed on the front half here. So when I took that off, what was over underneath right here, we would actually have the pulmonary trunk coming out right there. If we flip it over on this side, the right ventricle would contract, pushing the blood up this way through into here the pulmonary trunk, which I've opened up wide here. What we would see at the opening of the pulmonary trunk is this valve system here. So this is going to be the pulmonary valve. So when blood starts to come back down the pulmonary trunk towards the right ventricle, it would open up this valve right here, closing off and keeping the blood up there until the next heart contraction pushed it along. So blood comes up through this tube, would split off and go to both lungs, and would eventually come back. So that's the first half of path of blood through the heart. Blood would come back in over here on our left atrium. So up here we have the left atrium. It opened up right here. It's going to contract and push blood down this way towards the left ventricle, and it's going to go through the bicuspid valve. So here I'm going to go ahead and rip it open the rest of the way. And we can see here that I'll go ahead and slice a little bit more off here so we won't have as much in our field of vision. So hold on just a little bit longer here. The heart's a pretty sturdy structure when it gets down to it, and lots of stuff there. So we'll take a little bit more out of the way. And now we can see the bicuspid valve a little more clearly. So it's a really big valve right here. It actually seems to be a little bit bigger than the tricuspid valve, even though it only has 2 flaps instead of 3. So we can see here some of these chordae tendonae I've actually cut, but there are some of them still attached down here. So I'll just grab hold of a couple of them with the forceps here, and you can see they're anchored from the bottom edge of the flap down here to the papillary muscles. And if I grab hold of one of those to pull on it, I'm pulling pretty firmly on that chordae tendonae, and it would rather slide through my forceps than pull free. And I'm putting a pretty good amount of force on that. So those are pretty sturdy, and they're going to make sure, again, those valves don't open up backwards. We don't want them to open up back into the atria again, or that would have reversal of blood flow. So we've gone through our bicuspid here, and now we're down here in the left ventricle. When we look at the musculature, just like we did in the lecture, we can see here's the wall of the left ventricle. Here's the septum in between the left and right ventricles. But if we look at the thickness of the musculature here compared to the thickness of our right ventricle over here, we're looking at 3 to 4 times the thickness in the left ventricle that we had in the right. And again, the reason for that was that we wanted to have enough force generated on that blood from the left ventricle to push it all the way to the toes, and then all the way back up here to our right atrium again. So it needs to be much more muscular to achieve that. Now when the blood leaves the left ventricle, it's going to go up towards the aorta. So I'm going to do another cut for us here to open things up a little bit more. And here we can see I've sliced through the aorta, and I'll go ahead and stick my finger through. Here's where it would come out the back side of the aorta and branch off to the rest of the body. But inside, I'll go ahead and slice it all the way open, again, just so it doesn't keep trying to close on us here. Bodily tissues don't often just easily come apart and stay that way, so we kind of have to fight through the system. Let me go ahead and chop off a little bit more of the septum here, and that will open up our view as well. There we go. So the left ventricle contracts, pushes the blood up here towards the aorta, and what we have here is the aortic valve. So this flap of tissue right here is going to look just like the pulmonary valve did on the pulmonary trunk, and it's going to prevent backflow of blood into the left ventricle again. So the blood goes up through the aortic valve here into the aorta, and then out to the rest of the body. And you can see the aorta here is really big. I can easily stick a couple of fingers up inside it, and that would then complete the blood flow through the heart. This would probably be a lot more fun if you were doing it in person in the classroom, and some of you would probably end up with a nicer looking dissection than I have here. But hopefully you've been able to appreciate the pieces and parts here and what they really look like, and also hopefully appreciate the fact that the imagery in the book, and even the specimen images you see in the book of real hearts and such, were achieved via a lot of very careful, very particular dissection. I spent, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes slicing this up before I came back on film here. If I'd spent about 30 to 40 minutes very carefully slicing and teasing about, I probably could have come up with a much more beautiful looking specimen. Well, let's just briefly review the process here. We started out over here at the right atrium. It contracted, pushed blood through our tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, which sent its blood up through the pulmonary trunk to the lungs. Comes back in over here at the left atrium, pushes that blood through the bicuspid valve, left ventricle, up through the aortic valve, aorta, and down and out to the rest of the body from there. So that process is happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly throughout your life. This heart is contracting on one side or the other to get blood flowing through the system. This was a sheep's heart. I don't know if I told you that to start with or not. So this sheep's heart, if our heart's about the size of a fist, this sheep's heart isn't horribly off from the size of my heart. If you happen to be a little bit bigger or smaller than I am, you would obviously have a larger or smaller heart to go along with that. But this heart is about the right size to have been my heart. So if we put that all back together, put that on me, my fist, we're pretty close. So my heart will be just a little smaller than that. For reference, I'm 6'1" and I weigh 245 pounds. So this is about what it would take for me. Some of you might have a heart maybe half again smaller than this, if you don't happen to have as much body mass to support. If you happen to be bigger than I am, then you would have a larger heart than that. So hopefully, again, this was informative and not too awfully confusing. And I would, again, apologize for the quality of filming here in my home studio. We're kind of improvising, and this isn't a really professional job, but it's what we've got to work with. So thanks for joining us on this, and we'll see you next time.